Alrighty, so in these videos I'm going to be going in order from how the system actually works to how we can modify it, and then from there I'm going to go into the installer last. That way, when we're talking about variables and attributes in the installer, we will actually know what they're referring to in here. So, first thing I want to point out is that so we have our three effects that the plugin will install. We have our full, our pan only, and our tilt only. The pan and the tilt only are for if you want to be if you want to be pushing up just the pan attribute or just the tilt attribute on its own handle. The full one is pan and tilt. The only thing, everything we do here will affect all three of these, with the exception of the pan and tilt disable macros. Obviously we don't want to disable the only line on an effect, so these only apply to the full effect. So with that said, we're going to vaguely make our way from top to bottom on this thing. So the first setting we see here, first off, let me get this thing running with groups of three here. The first thing that we've got is our phase options. So here are all of our various phases that we can choose from, and on the top left we have X to 0 or 0 to X, which basically changes whether our effect is moving from left to right or right to left. So right now we can see that it is moving from right to left on the screen. If I hit X to 0, the effect will change around so that it is now flowing from left to right. This is not the same thing as changing the direction. You'll notice the way that the fixtures overlap looks different when it's moving right to left than it does when it's moving from, or left to right, than it does when it's moving from right to left. Because the rotation of the fixture itself has not changed. So if you want to take the rotation of the fixture and move that opposite, we have the direction button for that instead. So if I hit this guy, we can stop it mid-cycle and have it switch directions. So that's what the direction button's for, versus the phase button, which controls which way the effect itself is moving. From there we have our various different phases, so we can set, as one of the defaults I included a phase of 0, so when we set that we can see everything moving at the same time. I can do a phase of 90 where we have just the slightest amount of difference from one side of the rig to the other. Phase 180, and again these are all the defaults. This is something we can change which options automatically show up. One cycle, which is just a phase of 360. And it's worth pointing out as we're going through this, all of these macros and commands have been set up to be human readable. So for example, setting the phase to 360 is as simple as this Lua command with the phase value of 360. If you decide that you want to add in another phase value, instead of having to reinstall the entire system, you can just copy this macro and, for example, change this to, I don't know, let's say it was minus 360. So now, if I click on this guy, we have basically the same thing that would have happened if I had hit X to 0. So these are set up to be pretty understandable to read, so if you want to make a copy, make a new version of a macro that you already included, you'll be able to do so here. When you do make that copy, any of these things that have visual feedback, they're not going to quite respond the same. You'll notice that if I go back and change this to minus 360 again, that when I click it, it doesn't have any visual feedback because it is looking for the macro that is labeled as having that phase number. You'll also have to set the info on that macro to match. So again, that is all set up to be pretty easy to understand. Just be aware that that's how the visual feedback is working, is there is an info field in each of these. Actually, if I just pull up an info window here, info of this macro, we can see that we have position effects. Ignore the ID part, and you can just change the value field to match whatever you've put in that macro. So anyways, just be aware that is how the plugin is understanding where a lot of these macros are, is by what's stored in the info field. So if you make a new one, update the info field, update the line. They're both pretty straightforward as far as what you need to see. Moving back to the effect setup itself, Let's change this guy back to normal. All right. And then 2 cycles and 3 cycles and so on. So you get the idea of how these work. Down below we have our group options. So right now we are set to no groups. If I switch to 3 groups, we will see 3 groups start up. If I switch to 2, we can see that we have 2 basically separate phases going at the same time. If I switch to groups of 4, we split it into groups of 4. I mean, this is pretty directly just altering the number of groups in the effect itself. Now, what I did add into this is changing how groups can be handled. So right now we're set for interleave groups, which means it's just going, right now every 4th fixture is on one phase, the next one over will be the next phase, so on. It's what you normally expect to see when you set 4 groups. If I click this button from changing groups to from interleave to blocks, we will see that it'll actually split the rig into 4 distinct blocks from one side to the other to make this effect happen. So if you're going for something a little more bold, more likely for an EDM show, this gives you the ability to actually split the rig into sections. So right now if I split it into chunks of 3, we have 3 distinct groups on the rig working in sync with each other. If I switch back to interleave, then we are back to an interleave look. To go with this, we have 2 macros at the bottom right, selection follow to blocks and selection follow to interleave. What these do, so by default what I set it up to do was that when you are in groups, either in interleave or blocks mode, it will ignore your current selection order and it will use whatever selection makes sense for the application. So for interleave, it completely ignores selection order, it goes by fixture number. That way, because when you, for example, to show you what happens when you don't have it set up like that, this is what interleave looks like if I'm following my all left to right order. Because sometimes the 3 fixtures over from one fixture might be the one directly next to it on that truss. So while it makes sense looking at a layout maybe, when you look up at the rig, it just looks really sloppy. So I set in these buttons in case you wanted to force it to do that. However, by default, it will use the fixture numbers. Same thing on the blocks. There's actually a engine setting for this one, telling it which group to use. But by default, it will use the group in that configuration. If I set follow to blocks, let's switch to our rows option. So if I keep the selection in our blocks, did I goof something here? Alright, well I'm going to have to look into that one. That is a bug. But anyways, the point is that it's supposed to look really bad if I do that. I don't know what it is that happened here that it's ignoring that. But anyways, we'll take care of that. Oh, there we go. That's what it would look like. So I just need to change when that gets triggered. So if it's following your existing selection order, it'll end up looking like this. Ideally, we want it to look like that. So we keep it with a separate group just for that. Again, that's in the configuration settings. I'm just explaining what these 2 buttons are for. Generally, I don't expect that you'll want them, but they're there if that's what you want to do. Next down are the pan and tilt lines I mentioned previously. So if I edit this effect, well, I guess we're going to have to look at all 4 screens here. All right. So right now, pan and tilt are both enabled. If I disable pan, we will see the form on the pan line has changed to stump. If I disable tilt, we'll notice 2 things. One, pan got re-enabled so we don't get stuck with an effect that is doing absolutely nothing. And second off, tilt got disabled as expected. You'll notice that these are set for a form of stomp. I tried it originally with a form of release, and that instead forced all of that parameter to its home position. So instead of just ignoring the effect line, it actually made it home straight down, which was not very helpful. So it's set to stomp, which means it will conflict with other effects if you are running this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the pan and the tilt lines are not affected by the pan and tilt enable features over here. And just to show you that on the screen, We'll switch back to some interleave groups over here. We'll re-enable tilt, so we have our full circle effect going here. We will disable tilt. We have just pan going on. We'll disable pan, and we have just tilt going on. So there is that part of it. I guess I probably could have brought this one up earlier, but we have the shuffle button here. Make this screen big again. We set the shuffle button. It does exactly what you think it does. Probably most handy for no groups at all if you want to make a Bally effect go. So there's our shuffle. Last at the bottom left, as far as the layout's concerned, is our symmetry and wings. Symmetry will change which presets are being used. Let's switch to back to the selection order. There we go. All right, so symmetry changes which presets are being referenced here. So right now that I've turned on symmetry, we will see that our low and high values for pan are presets labeled out and in. If I disable this, they are presets labeled left and right. Because negative wings don't work with presets in MA, there are separate presets that are being copied over to allow symmetry to happen so that you can make one side mirror what the other side's doing. Next to that's the wings button. I'm not really sure when you'll be using one without the other, but I have them currently separated. If you want to keep them together, you can just copy this macro line into the other macro, or the other way around. So enabling symmetry and wings will give us exactly what we expect, which is this nice big symmetrical effect over the span of our entire rig. That's pretty much it for that. One enables the symmetry presets, one actually enables, sorry, I didn't explain that. This one actually enables wings inside of the effect. So right now we see we have 2 wings. If I disable this, we will see we have 0 wings, even though we have our symmetrical preset selected, which looks kind of weird up there, but if you're going for weird, it's an option. So there's all of those. So that covers the entire layout portion of this. All that's left from there, so we already went over the direction button. From there, we have our group selection button. So just like with the color and dimmer effects, we can select which groups are actually included in this effect. We have our selection order, so I can change from the big wall effect to, I'm never going to want that anywhere else, to rows, so we can have it iterating over rows, to a snake selection, which is just rows alternating directions, to my circle selection. Realistically, I haven't been using this with anything except my big left to right selection, but I left the option in here in case it was something that was still wanted to play with. You can always just keep it on the same group all the time. Below that, these buttons are actually intended to be moved to executors, so I'm going to do that. And these will change the rate of what is going on stage. A lot of the time when I'm doing a punch show, especially anything EDM, I'll play around where I will change the speed of my position effect when I'm strobing those fixtures. Kind of gives it, I always think of it as a Matrix looking effect. Matrix is in the movie. I can't explain why necessarily, but it kind of gives it a slow motion feel when I do that. So if I hold the slow button down, we'll see that the rate of the entire rig drops pretty significantly. If I release it, it goes back to the normal speed. Same thing with the fast button. If I hold this down, the circle effect will speed up. If I release it, it goes back to its original speed. A little more subtle on that one. These are both things that can be changed, exactly how fast that will go in the user config settings, which we'll talk about in the next video. Below that, we have our reset position groups macro and our reset position effects engine macro. So if we click this, it will reset everything that we've changed here. If we click on the reset position groups, it will reset just all of our groups, so that it'll reset what's been stored in there. If somehow you've ended up with fixtures stored in the effect that weren't part of these macros, this will allow you to completely wipe it out and start over. So that covers all of the functions of the effect engine. In the next video, I'm going to go into the user config settings.